All right. Well, thanks for joining everybody. It looks like we're reaching a critical mass here, and wanted to welcome you to the webinar on data and decarbonization. And we're here today to talk about data silos. And I think it's only fair that first we start with ourselves. Because now here at Regrow, we've been friends with HowGood for a number of years. We've done industry collaborations and community events. But more recently, we've come together to break down our own data silo, bring our platforms together and make it easier for data to connect from field down into product carbon footprints. Now, if you're new to Regrow, we're the Ag Resilience platform, and we help you take action on farm to decarbonize your supply chain. If you're new to HowGood, they have the world's largest database for food product sustainability. And so together, we're bringing this data together to enable companies to take action on their Scope 3 footprints. Now, we have a good collection of folks from across both of our teams here today. I want to introduce everybody. We have Ava Clark, Head of Marketing at HowGood, Michael Streitberger and Emily Spence, who lead partnerships. And you don't see them on the screen here, but they'll be joining us for the Q&A at the end. Then Crystal Granger will be leading the presentation from HowGood today. She's the Director of Growth and Innovation. Xenia, who leads product development for sustainability insights here at Regrow, will be presenting. And my name is Jacob Talbot. I lead marketing here at Regrow as well. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of our roadmap for today, first, we're going to share some of the data challenges that we see with, with Scope 3 reporting. We're going to talk about how you can turn your procurement data into actionable strategies. We're going to have some demos of what this actually looks like in real life, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions as we're going through this, please add it to that Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We look forward to talking with you all at the end. So now I want to start with a little bit of a story. You know, in food and ag, we face this common challenge where it's difficult to align climate action to the ingredients that we actually source and buy and use from our supply chains. And we were talking with a company not too long ago who's doing something that many of you either have done, you're thinking about doing. They wanted to start taking action in their supply chain and start cutting their emissions and make progress toward what was a pretty ambitious Scope 3 reduction goal. So they reached out to one of their suppliers and they started running a pilot program with some farmers in an area that looks about like what you see here. And after running the program for a year, we started talking with them about how they could take the results from this program into their supply chains. Now, as we started digging into their specific supply chain, we discovered that the places that they had aligned with their supplier on weren't actually directly connected to the areas that they were sourcing. And this has a lot of downstream consequences, right? So they were trying to make an impact on their supply chains, but because they didn't have enough precision in understanding where to focus with their suppliers and actually enroll the right growers, they ended up missing the target commodities they were hoping to reach. If you've done some reporting with Scope 3 and GHGP compliance, you may know that if you're not focused on the right areas, then this can actually impact your downstream claims and your product carbon footprint or your LCA or your corporate inventory. And if your company is thinking about how regenerative agriculture can make an impact on your supply resilience to make you more resilient to future weather events, this of course is not providing that impact that you're looking for. So this is kind of a stark example, but it's something that's truly not unique, right? And this push for having greater understanding of what our supply chains look like and how we can use that to make more actionable strategies to really make an impact where it matters in our supply chains. There are a lot of pressures coming from different areas to push this forward. You know, I mentioned reporting guidelines a minute ago. Transparency and traceability are becoming increasingly important in GHGP, especially if you want to be thinking about removals in your supply chain. Likewise with SBTI and how you make claims in your product carbon footprint. And we're seeing the increasing impacts of extreme weather on supply chains. In just the last year, Midwest wheat yields were impacted by drought, flooding in Europe impacting potato fields. And over the next decade, it's expected that higher average temps are going to be increasing food inflation by more than 3% by 2035. And many of you are probably experiencing this macro environment that we're in right now, where it's more important than ever that we are really tight on where we're making investments in sustainability. Our finance teams are requiring it. We can't have stranded assets like we saw in that example a moment ago. And ensuring that as we scale our programs and invest more in making more impact, there's going to be ever more budget scrutiny on these activities. So With this in mind, the question is how can we get the right data to help us make smart decisions, not just on the back end when we need to report, but all the way through from that initial conversation with our suppliers, all the way through to when we're making action in our supply chains, trying to claim that impact. And to that, many of you may be somewhere on this journey here. This is a very common approach that people take to trying to get more information into what their Scope 3 footprint looks like. People often start with a relatively coarse spend-based method where you're looking at the amount of money that you put into different ingredients, multiply that by an emissions factor that corresponds to that spend, and that gives you sort of a rough cut of what your emissions look like. You might mature from that into an average method where you can take the emissions associated with an ingredient for, say, a particular crop, particular region, like the United States, multiply that by the volume that you're sourcing, so getting more precise there, and then coming up with your carbon footprint. And this gives you more clarity into where your emissions are most material, so that you can continue on this journey to get more specific supply chain data. Move to a hybrid method where you're bringing in more supplier data alongside some of these averages, ultimately trying to get to a place where you have, for your most material ingredients, supply specific data that ties to the actual ingredients that you're sourcing so you can quantify where you are now, make smart decisions going forward, and then claim that impact on the back end. And I'm curious for the group here today where everyone sits. And if I can find it here, I'd love to do a quick poll. I think I might need to stop sharing. I'm going to pull up a question just to see for all the folks here, where are you focusing some of your efforts? Are you doing spend-based method, the average method, hybrid method, supply-specific method, or some combination of all of these? See some people checking in here. It's really interesting. We're seeing a real mix of things coming through here. So we'll give you just a couple more seconds, and then we'll share the results. All right, slowing down. Let's go ahead and end that. Show those results. So you can see that there's a real mix, right? We've got people who are a little bit earlier in their journeys working on the spend-based method. And then we've got a number of people who are, across the journey in different ways here. So a number of you have matured into some of these hybrid and supplier-specific data sources. And I imagine there are a number of you who are, across several of these. And if that's the case, my expectation, let me share screen here again. My expectation is that as you've matured from some of those more coarse methods into some of this more supplier specific data, you've got to a point where you're looking at doing some surveys. You might be undertaking some direct supplier surveys to get data on what kind of practices growers are using and how that's influencing emissions. Your suppliers might in turn be doing grower surveys, or you might be doing them directly, bringing in data on the various inputs that they're using from the invoices from their upstream suppliers. You might be going out to the field and doing some field sampling to validate what some of this data looks like, or even doing some direct soil sampling. And these supplier surveys, they have a real place to fit into this overall journey, right? If you're running a regenerative agriculture program, it's really important to get some of that direct data from growers about what they've done historically, what they're going to do in the future, and use that to validate the impact that you're making. Or if you have a really material ingredient in your supply chain where it's hard to get other scalable data sources, surveys are a really good solution. But my guess is that if you've done surveys, you've also seen some of the challenges. So response rates can be tough, right? Data doesn't always talk to each other, where you might be sending out a spreadsheet that different suppliers track things in different ways, and you're trying to harmonize all of this. And it can be a real challenge. And I would argue that while this might seem like sort of a point source problem, it's actually representative of some of the broader data silo challenges that we see in our industry. And these are both inside of our organizations and outside of our organizations. Internally, we've got different teams, our sustainability team, regenerative agriculture team, our procurement teams. They are all working toward their separate goals and often speak different languages, right? Procurement thinks about POs. Sustainability might be thinking in the GHGP language of what is the first point of aggregation so we can make sure we have the precision we need to make the claims that are important for us. Then our data systems don't always talk to each other. The ERP on procurement doesn't necessarily speak to the ESG tools that we're using for reporting. They have different data models and they aren't necessarily interoperable. Then when we look outside of our organization, we have additional challenges, right? Buyers have many suppliers, suppliers have many buyers. The transfer of data across these different parties can get very intensive. And again, we don't have interoperability between many of our systems. Add to this, then we see some of the incentive challenges where data requests are often coming upstream to suppliers, right? And we need to ensure that there's shared value for them, for the growers, and all of this tied together to make sure that as we're trying to get more precision so we can make smart decisions about our investments in sustainability, we have scalable approaches to do this. And so with this in mind, I wanted to offer sort of a suggestion here that instead of thinking about procurement data as just a jumping off point for more surveys, there's another way that we can think of procurement data as absolutely essential to the way that we structure our sustainability strategy. And we've seen a number of companies taking this kind of approach increasingly these days, where procurement data, rather than being this point of trying to start a conversation about what are some of the more specific data sources you can give me, it actually provides information about the commodities that you're sourcing, the volumes, the facilities that can then inform insight into what are the actual sourcing regions, what are the processing facilities, what are the counties that we're sourcing from. And using modern technology like remote sensing, AI, and soil carbon modeling, we can get insight into the practices being used on the field, what land use change looks like, and ultimately what primary emissions data looks like just from procurement data. Now, I know that sounds really abstract. I promise that in a little bit when we go through the demo, this will seem a lot more clear. But let's assume that we've got this state where we've got more insight into what's actually happening in our supply shed before we even talk to a single supplier, or before we talk to some of our counterparts even internally in our organization. And this can then be a jumping off point for actual stakeholder alignment, bringing value to the conversation, saying, I've done some analysis. I have a sense of these are our key commodities. This is where it's most material. These are the practices used. These are the kinds of actions we can take that will actually drive more resilience in our supply chain and progress toward our carbon targets. And then from that, can move toward a place where you've actually been able to take clear action on regenerative agriculture, R&D work to work on reformulations, and ultimately drive all the outcomes from this work down into your annual reporting, down into your disclosures like CSRD and CDP. So this is the vision that we've been working toward here at Regrow and HowGood, is how we can bring impact traceability and data continuity across all the way from that procurement data down into the actions that you take and the reporting that you need to do on the back end, tracing emissions right down to your supply shed, taking action with regenerative agriculture, understanding what the ROI is as you're investing in some of these projects. Bringing this data from the field down into HowGood, getting enriched with this full database of EFs so that you can have that complete product carbon footprint, inform your product reformulations, and then conduct your reporting on down into your carbon reporting service, whether that's Watershed, Salesforce, or one of your consulting partners, and ultimately down into your disclosures. So you're going to see what all this looks like in practice here in just a few seconds. So I'd love to pass this over to Xenia to give a glimpse into the Regrow platform, and then we'll hand things off to HowGood as well.
Thanks, Jacob. Hi, everyone. My name is Xenia, and I lead product development for our Sustainability Insights platform here at Regrow. Today, I'll do a little bit of a demo about how companies that work with Regrow take their procurement data to turn it into sustainability data and gain insight into the supply chains, emissions, practices, risks, and abatement opportunities. So companies we work with typically come to Regrow with procurement data that looks something like this. There is suppliers, there is the location of the first point of aggregation, might be an address, might be a city or state, might be something even more vague than that, the commodity that they source from there, and optionally the volume they get from that. With the tools that we built at Regrow, using LLMs, literature review, as well as internal knowledge, we're able to take this information and turn it into shapes on a map. Typically, these shapes look like circles, the center of which is the location of the first point of aggregation, and the radius corresponds to the distance that a certain commodity typically travels. we're able to find all this information through the tools that we've built, as well as whether the commodity is grown nearby the facility or it might be railed in from a nearby area. Using our remote sensing technology, we're able to, within these shapes, find the fields that grow the commodity of interest and only show data for those fields. For example, if a company sources from an area that grows both corn and soy, but the company only gets corn from that area, we're able to isolate just the fields that grow corn and pull data for those. Now, what does that data actually look like? For the same shapes that we looked at that basically map to the company's supply chain, firstly, for the commodity of interest, which in this example is corn, and for the crop year of interest, which in this example is 2024, we look at emissions factors or emissions intensity from cradle to farm gate. And importantly, we look at the emissions that are produced on field from activities such as residue management and fertilizer application, which we know are the most intense ones, as well as transportation, plant protection use, fertilizer production, etc. Everything included from the cradle to the farm gate. Now, how do we actually quantify these? To quantify these, we first look at all the practices that happen on a field, whether that's tillage activity, cover cropping, various crop rotations. We combine that with third-party data about weather, soil types, etc. And we run this information through our DNDC model that quantifies field emissions. The same practice data we use to also quantify other related cradle to farm gate emissions factors. Now, all of that is used for reporting, but it also can inform actions that companies can take. So for the same shapes that we drew on the map, we now look, and using the same technology that I just described, we now look at what is the abatement opportunity should a company decide to invest in regenerative agriculture within that supply chain by incentivizing certain types of interventions. So again, using the same technology, and for every permutation of processing facility or first point of aggregation, commodity and intervention combinations, we are able to model the abatement potential per acre and break that down into GHG emissions reductions and SOC sequestration. Again, I'll stress that one more time. This is for areas within the company's supply chain so that they're able to take action where it's within its value chain. All of that now gets back into reporting. Because we're able to observe the fields that practice MRV programs after they are completed, we're also able to omit them from the supply shed report, emissions factors report, which now allows us to report compliantly with within GHGP guidance and avoid double counting of impact. All of that data is now ready to be plugged into HowGood and make that database and that data even more actionable. So I'll let Crystal take over from here and talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Xenia. Let me go ahead and share my screen. First and foremost, it's great to be here with the Regrow team and talk about breaking down silos, which is the best way to drive real decarbonization outcomes. As you just heard from Jacob and Xenia, and probably in your own life in real time, the market signals are pretty loud and clear. GHGP is pushing for traceability, SBTI requires supplier alignment, and we're all seeing climate risks play out daily. The takeaway for food and beverage companies like yourselves is pretty straightforward. You can't just rely on generic estimates anymore. You need supply-specific data if you want to make real progress. So here's the challenge. Even if you're invested in precise field level data from the folks at Regrow, how do you actually make that usable across your entire organization? That's where we come in. At HowGood, our footprinting platform makes sure that high quality data doesn't just sit in a silo. Instead, it becomes the foundation that your teams can use for things like reformulation, sourcing decision, reporting, and long-term planning. The key is everyone working from the same numbers. So no more different methodologies across different departments or different partners, and no more siloed insights. We work with the food supply system to power product carbon footprinting, full scope reporting, consumer claims, and supplier engagement, all drawing from our global carbon database to produce standardized granular emissions data sets. Here at HowGood, we've seen that no matter where you sit in the supply chain, the real unlock is making sustainability part of your core operations by putting unified, actionable data at the center of everything. Now, partners like Regrow give you accurate, highly granular regional data, and that is a huge unlock because everything else builds from that foundation. When you bring that data into a system like HowGoods, you can start to essentially use it anywhere and everywhere that you need it, whether that's setting your scope 3 baselines or discovering hotspots within your supply chain so that you can target reductions and abatement strategies. You might be wanting to respond to customer data requests or submit your regulatory or voluntary corporate reports. You might even be focused on increasing sales or making consumer-facing product claims. But accurate data isn't the only end goal. Data democratization lets you take smarter enterprise-wide action, and that's where HowGood fits in. Enriching that sourcing data so that it works across all of your downstream needs. So, what does data enrichment look like? You've now got great data, but you need to contextualize it to the business realities of your food and beverage company. Let's say that you are a manufacturer of a granola bar. You've got your newest product in development, which is this lovely granola bar made of oats and brown rice syrup and peanuts and oil and maybe some sunflower seeds for crunch. With Regrow, you're getting highly accurate source and regional specific data to some of and for some of those ingredients. We'll say your oats are coming from Minnesota, your peanuts from Georgia, and your sunflower seeds from Germany. That gives you precise emission factors for those materials. But you've still got some ingredients where high resolution data isn't available, and that's where HowGood fills in the gaps. Because of the breadth of our database, we can immediately provide high quality, context specific emission factors for these other ingredients. So your brown rice syrup and your canola oil. HowGood's emission factors take into account aspects like ingredient concentration, and we model your emission factors based on things like most likely sourcing or production scenarios and locations. From there, we don't just leave you with a pile of numbers. We help you contextualize your emission factors into an actual product carbon footprint. So from our database of over 3.5 million food products, we can generate automated inclusion percentages for each of these ingredients in order to weigh your footprint accurately, even when you don't have a complete recipe. And if there are any retailers or distributors in our audience today, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know just how hard it is to track down this recipe information. So what you get is a product carbon footprint that is custom to you, that reflects your actual supply chain, and instead of a generic estimate. So you walk away with credible product carbon footprints for your product. Let's say for this lovely granola bar, that's 1.4 kilograms of COTE. Plus, with HowGood, you'll get to layer on some additional insights like the impact your granola bar has to the local biodiversity, or how much water is used to produce this granola bar. You'll also see from cradle to grave the entire life cycle of this granola bar and what types of consumer-facing claims it's eligible for. And that shared data set that we're talking about is now ready to power your reduction strategies, your supplier engagement, your reporting, and so much more. And so I'd like to dig into that a little bit for just a moment. So once you've got the unified data set, everyone starts speaking the same language. R&D can see the environmental impact of recipe changes in real time. Procurement can compare sourcing options and look at figures that include more than just the costs of those ingredients. And sustainability teams know which suppliers to focus their energy on. Plus, leadership across the entire organization can start to see and model scenarios across the entire portfolio for reduction. So when it comes to formulation, which is, as we know, is one of your biggest levers for reduction, this integration is monumental. You'll see exactly which ingredients are driving your hotspots, then model your recipe changes instantly. So what happens, for example, if I switch one of my sweeteners, or what happens if I switch one of my sourcing or practice. And because this data is pulling from the same data set that feeds your corporate reporting, you're not just experimenting as an R&D person within a vacuum. You're making these changes that the entire organization can actually stand behind. On the procurement side, that unified data set unlocks things like sourcing optimization. Buyers can now model the exact impact of switching suppliers or regions and see apples to apples comparisons. Let's say, for example, maybe you're shifting from sourcing your potatoes from Canada to Idaho, or your almonds in this granola bar from California over to Spain. Or let's say you're staying with the same supplier in the same region, but you're moving to practices like regeneratively grown. No matter the scenario, you'll see the impact clearly and in real time using the same methodology across the entire board. That means that sustainability now becomes part of the procurement decision right alongside cost and quality. Then there's supplier engagement, which for many of us means super resource intensive project planning, pulling in teams with who you may or may not have shared motivations or goals. What you really need here is focus, knowing which suppliers matter most so that you can target your attention and your efforts efficiently. With a unified data set, you can identify high impact suppliers, you can standardize comparisons, and you can streamline your data collection. And the data you do get from your suppliers flows right back into your corporate reporting and customer requests without any extra lift. Lastly, we have scenario planning, which ties everything together. You have the opportunity to now layer reformulation, sourcing changes, supplier initiatives, everything that we've just discussed, and see how they all play out over time. Your leadership team gets clear trajectories for reaching their goals, backed by data that shows where resources should go and how progress can be communicated both internally as well as externally. And because everything is built in the same data set, your R&D team, your procurement team, all of your supplier improvements move away from being siloed. They get to become all factored into this decision-making together. And at the end of the day, this isn't just about internal alignment. It's also about credibility with the outside world. Your disclosures, your customer communications, your reporting, even consumer-facing claims all pull from the same consistent data methodology, which is aligned to gold standard industry frameworks, which means that you're now ready for audits and any type of CDP, SBTI, or whatever type of reporting comes your way. So with that, I'd like to walk us through HowGood's platform Lattice and take a closer look at how this actually all works. Okay, so we're all in the food and beverage industry, and we all have a very similar challenge. We can't act on sustainability data that we can't access. And as I mentioned earlier, for most, data lives in silos. Procurement has one version, R&D has another, and sustainability teams spend a lot of time piecing all of that data together. By partnering with Regrow, HowGood's platform Lattice has changed that by connecting the dots from source all the way to measurable verified action. So supplier data comes into Lattice from a myriad of sources, directly through integrations with partners like Regrow, via direct uploads using the vendor request option here in the platform, or through HowGood's secure Supplier Connect portal for those suppliers of yours who don't have any sustainability data of their own. From this materials page in Lattice, you can instantly see the impact of your total procured portfolio, as well as supplier participation and data granularity. This right here turns dozens of scattered spreadsheets into a single effort, standardized data set that the entire team can use. Next, I'll show you what it's like to build a product from the ground up so that you can translate your data into sustainability impact using Lattice. Let's head over to the finished goods products page and look at a granola bar that I built using out-of-the-box HowGood data. In this granola bar, I've added my ingredients, including oats, my sweeteners, some ground almonds, and some flavoring. Lattice has made recommendations using AI and machine learning for the most likely sourcing and processing location. If you had updated data for those fields, you could absolutely change that. And you can also add data points like, do these ingredients apply or applicable for any standards or certifications like organic? You can see immediately the impact each nested ingredient in this formula has, including metrics like on-farm emissions, blue water usage, biodiversity impact, and more. And all of these individual metrics then roll up to the product level, this conventional granola bar, which shows you the overall product impact. Now, when HowGood data is paired with Regrow's in-field data, you can see exactly how field level practices shift these impacts in real time. In this example, let's say I wanted to replace my conventional sugar with a Regrow Ag beet sugar that includes in-field practice data. In Lattice, you can see the impact these changes would have to the granola bar. And right here is where the tangible ROI decisions are reflected. You can see in this granola bar now that the carbon footprint has dropped nearly 30%, down nearly an entire kilogram per kilogram. Plus, you see a reduction in blue water usage. All of that is just by replacing that conventional cane sugar with the beet sugar that included the in-field data from Regrow. You're instantly seeing the ROI of a practice and sourcing shift in real time. You can model the same for any ingredient that's applicable so that your procurement and R&D and sustainability efforts and teams all work from the same playbook and all have the same visibility. Lattice also reflects these changes to your internal dashboards, your supplier scorecards, any type of internal or external reporting that you have to do, as well as your product carbon footprints, which can be used for internal communication strategies or can be used externally to share with your customers who are asking for product level impact data. HowGood partners with the Carbon Trust for product carbon footprint methodology verification so that you're able to confidently communicate the impact of your products. So this right here is how you turn your data into measurable decarbonization programs. In less than 5 minutes, we've gone from raw data to impact calculation to modeled scenario to being able to communicate all of this impact internally as well as externally. And when combined with Regrow's in-field data, you're not just predicting reductions, you're actually measuring them in real time for the real world. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eva from the HowGood team to lead us into the Q&A portion of the webinar.
All right, thanks so much, Crystal. And good to see so many folks on the line. We've been getting a lot of questions directed about our data, about what integration looks like, about our methodology, about uses. And so I will bring some of those to the forefront, and also lots of opportunity to follow up with direct questions afterwards. So I'm going to start off with a question for Regrow. Can you speak a little bit about how you use procurement data to inform your emissions calculations?
Xenia, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, happy to. Okay. So the way we use procurement data is, firstly, we try to locate where the commodity is coming from, right? So we work with our customers. They a lot of them honestly provide purchase orders. And so we can, through that purchase order, can see where commodities are sourced from, how much of that. We use tools that we've built here at Regrow to determine the geolocation of the processing facility where that commodity comes from, and also, how far that commodity might travel, so that we can create a confined space from where that commodity is sourced. And that's where remote sensing comes in. In that area, we can look at the fields that grow that commodity of interest and start zeroing into the specific fields that we want to quantify emissions about. I think there are questions about how we quantify those emissions, so I'm gonna leave that for later, but hope that answers. And Jacob, if you wanna add, feel free to.
No, that's great. Ava, should I jump right into some of the questions that we've been getting about some of the methodologies on the quantification side?
Yeah, go for it.
So I saw a couple of questions coming in, both about how to think about the emissions factors that Regrow quantifies relative to some of the sources like World Food Life Cycle Database or other database solutions, and then some questions about how we actually get to that number to begin with. So the way to think about some of those databases is, they by their very nature have to think about some of the averages, right? So if you're looking at a emissions factor for a particular commodity, say like wheat in the United States, you're going to be trying to get a snapshot of what wheat grown in the United States looks like, whether that's in Nebraska or Kansas or the Western US. And there are going to be changes there, right? So by its very nature, there are going to be some differences between those two. Now, we've seen that there can be really stark differences both between a database emissions factor and something we'd quantify at Regrow, as well as when we are looking at some of the different emissions factors from region to region. And we've seen here in the United States, you can have, for a particular commodity, multiple times difference in an emission factor just because of things like the soil condition, the weather, the practices being used, how much fertilizer, the tillage practices, all these things go into that emissions factor. So it can be really material. And if you're interested in what this looks like for your particular commodities, we'd be happy to talk with you more about that. The other question was about sort of how we get to some of this data. And so I'll give a quick snapshot, and then Xenia, please fill in any gaps that I have here. But this kind of a multi-step process. First, we use remote sensing and machine learning to observe what's happening on cropland in a given region. So we look at the practices, the commodity, the time that it's harvest, all the things that can be observed from a satellite. We are able to interpret those images using machine learning to understand what those practices look like. That then feeds into our biogeochemical model, DNDC, or denitrification decomposition, which is one of a number of different soil models. We like this one because it's very variable or very generalizable across a lot of different commodities and geographies. And this allows us to take that information about how are things being grown and turn that into data about what the emissions profile of that commodity is. And so that's the general process. Happy to dive into more details again offline if you'd like to learn more.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jacob. And I think we're getting a number of questions as well about how HowGood collects their data. It's a different process, of course, than Regrow. And so I'll pose a question to Crystal. We have a question about, do we use EcoInvent or any other generalized database to collect our Scope 3 data? Crystal, maybe you can speak to how HowGood generates our emission factors for ingredients.
Yeah, absolutely. And an excellent question. So HowGood, first and foremost, we love data. And we, as well as first and foremost of loving data, are a data company. So we actually use our own greenhouse gas protocol, ISO aligned calculation methodology to build out the world's largest sustainability database. So that includes more than just carbon, that includes those other metrics I alluded to, like biodiversity impact and water usage. So we have the data. If you have your own data, because we're real fond of data, we're happy to take a look at anything that you're bringing in from EcoInvent. And that's exactly the definition of the partnership with Regrow, is being able to take the data that exists in different capacities and through different platforms and incorporate it into your product carbon footprinting and reporting under the same methodology, so that when you go to communicate that end result either to your customer or to somebody in like a regulatory capacity, you know that data, regardless of where it came from, its entire journey follows that methodology and that accreditation. And I would be totally stoked to talk more about that. Obviously, I love data as well, offline in at any point.
All right, great. Crystal, thank you so much. I think a good follow to that, we're getting a few questions, and apologies, we're not going to get to all of these. We're getting so many good ones in the chat, but we'll do as many as we can. A good follow on to that when thinking about reporting and external use cases. We have a few folks asking about how, whether this data can be rolled up into or aggregated for watershed or Salesforce Net Zero reporting, and if there are any integrations available there. I think, Michael, you can be best positioned to speak to this aspect.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. And Crystal, you kind of alluded to it. We had the slide too earlier that kind of presented this nice, seamless end-to-end carbon accounting flow. The shorter answer is yes. But maybe to kind of back up a little bit, we work with a lot of big food brands. I've seen the purchase goods material lists. They're often quite long. The data availability for each material varies so much. So, the beautiful thing about HowGood and Regrow coming together kind of before we get to that reporting stage is there's going to be crop sources in there where Regrow can deliver hyper-specific calculations. There's going to be other spots where HowGood can also get really granular, even when there's little known about what it's made of, what it's comprised of, where it's sourced. And we bring all of that together, level of insight and kind of discriminating between certain materials that flow into the food products. But to answer the question specifically, HowGood has also formed these partnerships and integrations with the other side of the spectrum that can serve as kind of a hub or a harmonizer to feed these data that inform Scope 3.1 emissions into a watershed, a Salesforce, really any carbon accounting platform. And we've done that successfully in a lot of instances, and it's been an area that we've been focused on here in the last year. So all that's to say is yes, and happy to kind of dive into that more. But in the spirit of time, let's move on to the next question.
Sure. And feel free to follow up directly with any questions there. Another question for Regrow about your data collection methods, which is, you spoke about a little bit about AI and modeling. How do you go about your calculations there versus direct soil measurements?
Sure, happy to take a pass at this one. So soil measurement is a core part of how we build our models. So we are using these direct observations of your actual supply shed to quantify what your emissions look like. But then those quantifications themselves have to be calibrated. The model has to be calibrated for all the different geographies that we're working in, all the different crops that we're serving. And so in order to get to that answer, we have to use real ground truth data. This can be with partners that we work with on soil modeling, or it can be third-party, scientifically, academically validated and peer-reviewed literature as well. So all of that goes into making sure that the models accurately represent what the soil composition is in those particular localities. Is there anything you'd add to that?
No.
Great. Okay. There's another question about HowGood's platform. And Crystal, I'll have you answer this. Does every member in the supply chain involved in footprinting need to license tools individually in order for that data collection to work? Or does the agreement between, say, HowGood and a CPG support the full supply chain effort? And I love this question, just thinking about the interconnectedness of our very messy, beautiful food system. Crystal, yeah, go for it.
I absolutely agree with you, Eva. We're in it together. This is not, the theme of today is breaking down silos. Data cannot be collected in silos. We can't operate in silos. Sustainability cannot operate in silos. So also love this question. The short version is no, we actually try and open up the door to as many of your suppliers as possible with whatever avenue they can share their data in. So we've spent a lot of time developing these partnerships with Regrow, and then also making sure that your suppliers understand that even if they don't have their own sustainability or sustainability impact data, that they can access for free HowGood's database to build out their impact measurement. And more important than that, in opening the doors for sharing information, is being able to actually educate and enable your suppliers. Like, we want this to be a bi-directional conversation. We want you to go back to your suppliers and work with them on their impact and their potential reductions, so that they don't feel like this is just a demand for information or a request for information. We want it to go both ways. So yeah, to Eva's point, this is a very exciting question, and we've put a lot of effort and time in our partnerships and our own product development to make sure that we are very warm and fuzzy about who we bring in.
Great.
Eva, if I may jump in here, I think I want to add a little bit about the regrow side as well, because I think that is a really, really good question and an important point around value chain collaboration. We talked about how, we maybe feel like surveys are not scalable and there is an alternative way to do things by looking at procurement data. That doesn't mean that we want to go around suppliers by doing this process, right? So what we really have seen work well is that CPGs set up their supply chains using these tools, but then they go back and work with their suppliers to validate, collaborate further, and importantly, collaborate on what are the right next steps and the right actions to decarbonize on the areas of highest impact and highest opportunity. That was a really great question. Thank you to whoever asked it.
Okay, great. Someone's looking for a little bit more color around common data silo pitfalls that we are seeing or have helped folks to navigate. I'll open that up to the team and we'll see who jumps in. But what's some common data silo pitfalls?
I would love to go first. And the first pitfall that I see is naming conventions / nomenclature / too many acronyms. So it's just the definition of what the data is. I would say that a lot of success comes with building out a glossary of terms, so that you start with a unified messaging, literally the words match the same before you start to fetch the data that you work with your internal teams on.
I can go next. I know this is not necessarily a data silo answer to the question about data silos, but truly what I've seen as a common pitfall is that teams are not, talking frequently with each other on, common goals and, common milestones. So I've seen a lot of our customers that, take the procurement data and collaborate more closely with their procurement team, then take that sustainability data that's transformed at this point back to them. Just, talking more and setting common goals and meeting more frequently. I think it starts with that connection and then goes back into the data.
Yeah, I love that and absolutely second that.
I'll third it, and maybe just to add a personal sentiment. If you're going to go the extra mile and get to this level of specificity, why not use this, hyper specific emission factor in everything you do as a company? And in the spirit of communication, collaboration, right? Every report, every analysis, every procurement decision, every formulation decision should be informed by the same impact metric, right? And that's what we're after, and that's what we're trying to make easy.
Great. I'm going to do one last question and then I'll turn it back over to Jacob. But we've talked about the pitfalls. It's only natural to end on the good stuff. So we've had a couple of questions about how to determine sort of highest ROI. How do you balance supplier engagement versus a sourcing swap versus a formulation change? Trying to kind of sum up a lot of those questions, how would combining Regrow's field level data and HowGood's platform help users really understand where their greatest ROI is going to be?
I'm happy to take a first pass at that one, because we saw two different examples of how you can do this across our platforms, right? When Xenia was demoing, she showed how you can look across all your different supply regions with all the various interventions you could make through regenerative agriculture, through incentivizing no-till practices or reduced till, reduced fertilizer use, all that kind of stuff. and then using that information to quantify a total roll-up into what is your reduction potential through those practices, which you can then use to add on your various cost stacks, your incentives that you're providing to growers, your program costs, all those things. Now, at the same time, we saw exactly from Crystal's demo how you can do that same kind of a buildup with other practices like reformulations. And so I think when you bring these two approaches together, that can give you that more comprehensive view across all the various things you could do, your supplier switching, your reformulations, regenerative agriculture, to get that look across and then prioritize based on your particular supply chain and your ingredients, what's going to make the most sense for your organization. Anything you want to add on to that one, Crystal?
Yeah, I think that I'm going to answer the question with a non-answer, and I'll say that although there are various different types of ROI that you can measure and communicate, I think for me, my biggest piece of recommendation is to shift your mind from looking at ROI as a linear path to a cyclical, like a cyclical path. So you're not creating ROI to give that number to somebody and stop there. Like the partnership with Regrow and HowGood makes it like a full cycle. So you're able to build your ROI plan, prove out your ROI plan, and then perpetuate and build upon that ROI plan. So it's almost like a mind shift change from going from point A to point B to building like this cycle that comes in cycles. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you all so much. And again, feel free to follow up directly with any questions that you have that we didn't get to answer. But Jacob, with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Love that. Well, such a great note to end on. Thanks to the HowGood team, and thank you to everyone here on the call. One thing that's very, very clear is when we think about all these different data silos, all the different people that it's going to take to drive more sustainability in our supply chains, that's all of you, right? It's everyone on this call plays a role in helping to make this happen. And so if you'd like to learn more about this, I think there's no better way to get a sense of what this can look like for your organization than to see it in practice. When we end this webinar, you'll have an opportunity to complete a short survey with just like 1 or 2 questions, including would you like to see what this looks like for a product in your supply chain? You can get a customized PCF for your ingredients using data from Regrow and from HowGood. So we hope you'll take us up on that. We'd love to talk with you more. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to all of our presenters.